Hi hires, so we're looking at animal welfare, which is the key area 4 from sustainability and interdependence. Okay, so animal welfare is a big issue because obviously if you're looking at animals that are producing food, then the health of that animal is going to impact on the food production. So for ages, like basically for a very long time, what that looked like was looking at animal farming really in terms of how could you maximise. So you looked at how much they grew, the reproduction rate and disease resistance, because all you wanted was to basically get a lot growing quickly and producing more, okay, without any loss to disease. Okay, so what that gave us was a lot of intensive methods, and we now have a whole pile of these which are considered ethically really dodgy. Okay, they are unacceptable. So it's more than just looking at like how fast are they growing, how much is the reproduction rate, and are they not getting too many diseases. So it's now all enshrined in law basically. These are the 5 freedoms. So 5 freedoms are for all animals. This is the kind of set of them, and you can look at them and think, no, okay, they make a lot of sense. Okay, so this one, you would consider this to be very basic, you know, that they have enough to eat and enough to drink. Okay, you obviously would expect that they're not uncomfortable. Okay, and then pain, injury and disease, that you're keeping them healthy and that they're not in fear or distress. And this one is really tricky actually. The freedom to express normal behaviour. Okay, but you look at these 5 freedoms and you use them as a framework. Okay, so on the next slide we've got a framework of it. So if you wanted to try and assess how good the animal care was, so here we have up the top, we've got a high quality of life, and basically we're saying these 5 freedoms are always met. Okay, freedom from hunger and thirst, injury, distress, discomfort, and that they can socialise. Okay, so this we would be saying is that you have competent caregiving, you're looking after the animals that you have. Okay, and then we've got a good quality of life down. So we're saying, yeah, all of the ones that at the beginning you were going, yeah, these are absolutely necessary to say that, yeah, that'd be okay. And there may be points where it's not absolutely always possible for them to have normal socialization. So this might be, like this minus might be here just purely because you don't have any more examples of that species. So it might be one animal that you're looking after and they don't get to socialize with their own kind of animal because you only have one. Okay, so but they would still be considering that this is probably competent still. And then we get down a little bit further and you start to have more worries creeping in. So this is when we get to borderline, and this is, well, okay, they might have enough to eat and enough to drink, but then all of these ones start to cause problems and they're not able to express normal behaviour. Okay, and this is when you're saying this is borderline, that the animals are beginning to be at risk. And then we get to a poor quality of life where you're losing even the very basics, having enough to eat and drink and enough just being free from pain, injury and disease, and then losing out on the rest. And this would be saying, and they never really are happy, there's this bit up at the top just saying that they're kind of just generally not getting what they need. And this would be incompetent and you've got animals now suffering. And they're pretty dramatic in the last one. They say a life not worth living, and they're saying that basically we have none of them being met and that you're looking at then animal cruelty that can be prosecuted. Okay, so it's a nice kind of framework to use. So why does it actually matter when it comes to food production? Because that's really what we're talking about, is that there's costs associated with increasing animal welfare. Okay, so for example, you need to give them more space. But the benefits are not straight away seen. It's a longer term benefit. So that means that you can have a kind of push and a pull against this about certain companies that don't want to go down the route of actually increasing welfare because they're not prepared to put into the long-term quality of the product that you might get. And that long-term product, if it doesn't actually come back as a cost increase, then again, you're going to have people who are just going to go, well, no, I'm not making enough profit. So you get your kind of differences between free range and caged eggs and your free range meats and that big push to actually pay more. Okay, because if you can't pay more, then the costs for the welfare are not going to be offset. So this is an example from Australia, trying to push the idea of free-range eggs, saying what we have here is a much healthier egg with a lot more content to it, you would say is healthy. Okay, and then we've got the battery farm one on the other side. Now, what I would point out though is these bits here, the cheaper and more accessible. This comes in very closely to our food security that we said right at the beginning. This is access, and a lot of it is probably to do also with quantity. But this side here in the free range, this is quality. But you look at the cost of it and you say, right, okay, there's an offset cost, which again comes to access. So this is a really, really, really tricky thing. You have to balance, if you're looking to have a healthy population of animals that are producing food and from the people who are eating it, what you're taking out of the system and how much you're taking out of the system. So ethics are anything to do with what we have decided is right and wrong. It's a kind of group consensus as to what is right and wrong. Okay, and we would argue that all domestic animals or all domesticated animals are in our care, so there's ethics considered for their well-being, our ethical concerns about them. And it's not just their physical but also their mental well-being. So you have to consider the conditions they're being kept in, what that does for them physically, but also what that does for them mentally. Okay, so every single welfare concern is also an ethical concern because it is to do with whether it is right or wrong to keep them in those conditions. Okay, there are lots of ethical things about animals, like the example I've got down here is selective breeding. Now that's not an ethic in terms of its well-being, but it is about its ethics about whether you should be selectively breeding. You could say if the selective breeding ends up bringing about inbreeding depression, then there's a welfare concern, you know, so they cross over. Okay, so you need to know a few examples of how you would indicate you have poor welfare, and they're pretty straightforward. You just need to learn the terms. Okay, so one of the things you're looking for is just at the behaviour. Okay, so we're looking at these forms of behaviour that has changed. Okay, stereotypy, misdirected behaviour, a failure in sexual or parenting behaviour, and altered levels of activity. Okay, so that's your 4, and then you need to know examples. So stereotypy in this case, we are looking at something which is a repetitive motion. So pacing, like if you see an animal at the zoo just pacing up and down and up and down and up and down, and that's often because they just don't have any stimulation in the environment. Okay, and but the whole point is they are persistent, so they keep doing them. Okay, they are repetitive, and they don't have a function, so there's nothing useful in what they're doing. Okay, and so in zoos where you have animals that are often in totally wrong environments for them, and there's another ethical kind of choice about whether zoos are the right thing or the wrong thing. But what they try and do there is to try and reduce the stereotypy behaviours by giving them things which enrich their environment, okay, and give them something else to do, basically. Misdirected behaviour is a normal behaviour but directed in the wrong way. Okay, so for example in chickens, they should normally peck at flooring material. That's normal that they would be foraging, okay, scraping and pecking. But if they start pecking at their own feathers or at other chickens' feathers, this is misdirected. Okay, so you get things like sows and farrowing crates who normally would be moving their heads in a particular way to push nesting materials into what they would normally want. They will continue to do that movement but in a crate which doesn't have any of that. Okay, so the failure of sexual or parental behaviour is kind of obvious as well. Basically, if you have poor welfare, and this often happens again in places where you don't have the right social integration with animals that need a social background, then they stop engaging in what would be normal reproductive behaviour, and in terms of parenting they may completely reject the offspring. Okay, and if you've got poor parenting, then you can obviously have a knock-on effect on how likely the offspring are to survive, and how they behave because they don't have the parenting information. And in particular, when you start looking at animals that really do need the socialization, like your primates, and once you get up to them, the impact on the offspring can be quite drastic. And finally, we've got altered levels of activity. And basically what that means is that the extremes that you would not want to see, you're seeing. So you're seeing what's called hysteria. It's excessively high levels of activity and often aggression, and then apathy. So extremely low levels, and that might be an animal that's just excessively sleeping, okay, more than they should be. So enrichment is basically taking something about the environment and making it so the animal can access their normal behaviours. And so that might be something like at a safari park, dragging along the meat for the lions to run at it. You know, something like that would be equally enriching for them because it is allowing them to access their normal behaviours. And keepers in these kind of situations do a lot of work to try and just allow the animals to have natural responses, even though it's a totally different stimulus that they're giving them necessarily. Okay, so it also means socialization, and you find lots of ways that they try to actually give them something different to do. I don't want you to spend a lot of time worrying about this graph. I just want you to point out a couple of things about this. So this is the productivity going along the bottom here, and what we've got here is animal welfare. So there is a point here where you've got a lot of productivity, you've got a kind of reasonably high productivity with obviously a decent level of animal welfare, and you can actually improve the welfare with domestication, because at domestication you're actually starting to look after animals to a certain extent at the beginning, you could argue. Okay, so the animal welfare might improve because they're no longer having to forage for food, it's always being given to them, stuff like that, and you reach a high level of animal welfare, and the productivity has gone up because, you know, they're healthier, they've got all the food they need, all that kind of stuff. And then it's still doing quite well, you know, as we can increase productivity and we've got a high welfare thing. But now you get to a point where you start to intensify, and this is this issue here, that as you increase intensity of kind of production, that the welfare actually starts to drop. And even though you've increased productivity here, the welfare of the animal is starting to become less and less. And then over here you have a kind of proper dent in that to the point where it's starting to really damage everything. Okay, so what you want to do is find a balance that will allow you to have, you know, a high level of welfare. I mean, what they're saying here is this would be a social choice that's appropriate to give you a decent level of animal welfare and a good level of productivity. So finding that point and finding the one that ethically fits with your decision as to what is right and wrong. And you got to remember, ethics also, since it's a kind of group consensus, that can move. What is socially acceptable in one decade might not be a few decades later. So just to state again, the animal welfare is a holistic thing. It is about all of their physical needs, all of their mental needs, and whether you're able to give them the right environment to allow natural behaviours. Okay, and that's us.